In this lesson, we're going to talk about boundaries questions on the SAT reading and writing test. On the SAT, some questions will present you with a short passage that contains a blank. The question will then ask you to complete the text in a way that conforms to the conventions of standard English, which means follows the rules of standard English grammar. On the SAT, the standard English conventions are broken down into two categories: form, structure, and sense, and boundaries. And this is what we're going to talk about in this video. Boundaries questions focus on how phrases, clauses, and sentences are linked together in written English. So, boundaries questions talk about how we link phrases and clauses to form complete sentences. Boundaries questions will talk about three things: linking clauses, supplements, and punctuation. Let's first talk about linking clauses. First of all, let's talk about a clause. What is a clause? What are clauses? A clause is a series of words. It's a group of words that contains a subject and a conjugated verb. There are two main types of clauses: an independent clause which can stand on its own as a complete sentence, and there's the dependent clause, which must be linked to an independent clause because it can't stand on its own as a complete sentence. Let's look at an example of an independent clause. Dolores went to the store. Here we have a subject, Dolores, and we have a verb, went, and all of the group of words conveys a complete thought, a complete idea. Therefore, this is an independent clause. Now let's look at a dependent clause. Where she bought milk. Now, let's look at this group of words here. It does have a subject, she, and it does have a verb, bought, but it doesn't convey a complete idea. It conveys an incomplete idea. So we call this a dependent clause. To create a complete sentence, this clause would need to be linked to an independent clause. So it would go, the whole sentence will go like this. We're going to start with the independent clause, Dolores went to the store. Then I'm going to use a comma here, and then I'm going to attach the dependent clause, where she bought milk, and then I'm going to end it all with a full stop, period. Now we have a full sentence that has two clauses. This is the first clause, which is independent, and attached to it the second clause, which is dependent. The SAT focuses on how clauses can be linked together or kept apart, and these conventions may be tested in boundaries questions that you encounter on test day. Now, there are several ways to link in clauses. Actually, we're going to talk about 4 ways to link clauses. The SAT focuses on end of sentence punctuation, coordination, subordination, and the last one, using semicolons. Let's look at each in turn and start with the end of sentence punctuation. Using end punctuation like a period or a question mark is the simplest way to separate clauses. You should be very familiar with using end punctuation in your own writing. There are only 2 rules for end punctuation. Rule number 1, the punctuation mark must match the function of the sentence it follows, and rule number 2, end punctuation can only be used to separate 2 independent clauses. So let's talk about rule number 1, matching the function of the sentence with the end punctuation. So for example, if I have this sentence here, I've often wondered how are birds able to navigate? And then I'm ending this using a question mark. So of course, this version of the sentence is incorrect because it confuses the purpose of the sentence. By phrasing the second half like a question, how are birds able to navigate, which should not be the case, and ending things with a question mark. This is not a real question. The correct version of this sentence should phrase the sentence to function as a statement, not a question. And it should end things with a period. Let's take a look at how to correct this. It should be written like this. I've often wondered how birds, I put the subject first because it's not a real question, how birds are able to navigate. And then I use a period to end the sentence. The second rule of end punctuation states that we can only use end punctuation to separate 2 independent clauses. Let's look at this incorrect example. After sliced bread was introduced to the market in 1928, and then I'm going to use a period, it quickly eclipsed the popularity of unsliced bread. As you can see, the problem here is that we have an incomplete idea. We have a dependent clause followed by a period. The first clause in the sentence, which starts with after and ends in 1928, is a dependent clause, and it can't stand alone on its own as a sentence, so using a period creates an error. One way to correct this is to get rid of the period and use a comma. And of course, we're gonna use a small I instead of a capital I. So this is pretty much about it, about end of sentence punctuation. Let's talk about coordination now. Coordination involves the linking of 2 independent clauses within one single sentence. And as the name implies, coordination means that we're going to use a coordinating conjunction. So when we coordinate 2 clauses, we're going to use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. What are the coordinating conjunctions? The only coordinating conjunctions in English are known as the fanboys. That's an acronym that we use to remember them. So the coordinating conjunctions are as follows: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. These are the only coordinating conjunctions that we have in the English language. Let's take an example. Astronomical seasons are based on the position of the sun, and then I'm going to use a comma. So here's the first independent clause. Astronomical seasons are based on the position of the sun. That's the first independent clause. And then the second one, meteorological seasons are based on temperature and weather. So as you can see, this version of the sentence fails to use a coordinating conjunction. It just uses a comma alone, creating a comma splice error. We call this the comma between two complete sentences or two independent clauses. We call it a comma splice error. Now remember that. We're going to need it and use it a lot later on when we solve test items. Now, another way to mess up with this sentence is to write it as follows. Instead of the comma, we're going to put the fanboys word, but without a comma. So this version of the sentence fails to use a comma with the fanboys with the coordinating conjunction, and this creates a run-on sentence error. A run-on sentence error is when we fuse two independent clauses together without any punctuation in between. The correct way to join or to link these two independent clauses is to use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So I'm going to add a comma next to the word but, and there we have it corrected. Now, the third way to link clauses is by using what we call subordination. Subordination involves linking two clauses by making one of the clauses dependent. And we turn the clause into a dependent clause by attaching a subordinating conjunction to it. To subordinate an independent clause, we must use two things, a subordinating conjunction and a comma. Subordinating conjunctions are words that turn an independent clause into a dependent clause. There are many subordinating conjunctions, but some popular examples include although, since, because, while, when, after, if, unless, until, and as much more. Okay, we have a lot of subordinating conjunctions in the English language. So let's take a look at this sentence. Broccoli, kale, and kohlrabi may seem like very different vegetables, comma, they are all cultivars of the same species. This version of the sentence links two independent clauses using only a comma, creating a comma splice error. This is a comma splice. To correct it, we can start the first clause, the one that starts with broccoli, by adding though, by adding a subordinating conjunction. And it will look something like this. Though broccoli, kale, and kohlrabi may seem like very different vegetables, now the comma is correct. It's not a splice anymore. They're all cultivars of the same species. So after adding the subordinating conjunction, we now have a subordinate clause, an incomplete sentence, and then a comma, and then our main clause or our independent clause. And actually, we can do this by adding the subordinating conjunction, though the first clause is made dependent. It can then be linked to the second clause with just a comma. Some subordinating conjunctions can link clauses without a comma, but only if the dependent clause comes second. Let's look at it at an example for this. I went to the store, and then I'm going to use the subordinating conjunction because. So here I'm not using a comma because the word because comes in the middle of the sentence, so I shouldn't use a comma with it. I went to the store because I ran out of peanut butter. As you can see, the subordinate clause comes second in the sentence, so I'm not going to use a comma here. Let's look at another example. I will go to the store. Then I'm going to use the conjunction if I run out of peanut butter. So as you can see, because the subordinate clause comes second in the sentence, we don't need a comma here in the middle of the sentence with because or with if. Now let's talk about the fourth and last way to link clauses: semicolons. How can we use a semicolon to link two independent clauses without any conjunction? Because we can do that actually with a semicolon. Now let's take an example. The green zebra tomato ripens without turning red, and then I'm going to use a semicolon, which, this is a relative pronoun, which makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. As you can see, this is a relative clause because it starts with a relative pronoun. So it's considered a dependent clause. When I have a dependent clause attached to an independent clause like this, I should not be using a semicolon. I should actually be using a comma. So this version of the sentence uses a semicolon to connect an independent clause to a dependent relative clause, which creates a punctuation error. Now let's look at a second version of this sentence. The green zebra tomato ripens without turning red. Now I'm going to use a semicolon, and I'm going to use and, which is one of the fanboys. And this makes it difficult to know when one is ready to eat. Now, this second version of the sentence uses both a semicolon and a conjunction, which is unnecessary and unconventional. We cannot use a semicolon with a conjunction, a coordinating conjunction with fanboys. The correct version of this sentence should be like this. We should get rid of the fanboys word and just keep the semicolon, and this is what fixes this sentence. Now let's look at a linking clauses question now. Detroit natives Timothy Paul and Nicole Lindsay have combined their two passions, Detroit and beekeeping, to improve the health of their city's flowers and other vegetation. In 2017, the couple converted a vacant lot in the city into an apiary with nothing after it, or apiary with a comma, or apiary and, or apiary, comma, and. Let's continue the sentence. In the years that followed, they acquired 9 additional lots and established more than 35 hives. Let's look at this sentence because this is what concerns us, because it does have the blank in it. Now, this choice without a comma results in a run-on sentence error. Both clauses in this sentence could stand alone as complete sentences. This is the first one. The couple converted a vacant lot in the city into an apiary. And this is the second one. In the years that followed, they acquired 9 additional lots and established more than 35 hives. This is the second. This is the first independent clause. So we have 2 independent clauses. What should go in between them? How should we link them? So if both clauses in this sentence could stand alone as complete sentences, we cannot just use nothing in between. Independent clauses need to have certain kinds of punctuation marks between them. This choice doesn't use any punctuation between the two clauses, so it's no good. Now let's look at the second one, apiary and then a comma. This choice results in a comma splice error. Both clauses in this sentence could stand alone as complete sentences, as we said before, which means they're both independent clauses. A comma by itself, a comma alone, is not enough punctuation to link two independent clauses, so this is not going to work. Now let's look at number C, choice number C. This choice results in a run-on sentence error because it uses the coordinating conjunction and without a comma. So it's missing the comma beforehand, and that creates a run-on. So this is a comma splice. This creates another run-on sentence, and that leaves us with the only correct choice. This is the best choice, D, because this choice uses a comma plus a coordinating conjunction to link both independent complete sentences, which is one of the correct ways to link two independent clauses. Let's do another one. We have a blank here. Let's read the sentence from the beginning. It's tempting to glamorize the hunt for dinosaur fossils. And then in the first choice, we have a comma alone. The majority of field work is characterized by a daily routine of heat, insects, and tedious labor. As you can see, I have an independent clause here ending with fossils. So this is independent clause number 1. And then I do have another independent clause, the majority. This one, the majority of field work is characterized by a daily routine of heat, insects, and tedious labor. This is independent clause number 2. What should go in between? Should I use a comma alone? No, I actually can't, because this is going to be a comma splice. Should I use nothing in between? I actually can't, because this is going to be a run-on. Can I use but without a comma? Actually, this also creates a run-on sentence. So my only choice is to use comma and the fanboys but. So this is going to be the correct choice. Okay, let's try another one. Now, we should be careful here, because I can see at the beginning of the first clause, I can see a subordinating conjunction. So the first clause, which reads, though Paul Revere is best known today for his midnight ride during the American Revolution. This is the first clause, ends with revolution, okay? And because it starts with a subordinating conjunction, so I can say that it's a dependent clause. And then I have an independent clause that starts with he. He was famous in his own day as a prosperous silversmith and businessman. Now, this second part of the sentence is an independent clause. How can I join a dependent clause followed by an independent clause? Should we use a semicolon between them, just as answer A states? Actually, I can't. Can I use a comma and fanboys between them? No, because we use the comma fanboys between two independent clauses, so that's not going to work. Can I use a comma alone between them? Yes, we do use a comma between a dependent clause and an independent clause, especially when the dependent clause comes at the beginning of the sentence. Should we use nothing in between? We actually use nothing in between when the independent clause comes first, followed by the dependent, then we can use nothing between them. But in this case, we're going to use a comma. So the best answer is C.